Yes, I have 3 questions to 3 of the speakers.
Okay.
Or 1 question to each. To the first speaker, being a normal citizen, I'm appalled by how little our doctors know. And I saw that you say that only 1/4 of approved drugs, if I was correct, or approved things to do, was actually giving a benefit. So why do we need the 3/4 available? Why couldn't we use less, for instance? To the third speaker, one thing I agree totally with your perspective about the patient's ability to think themselves and have a different perspective than everybody else. But there are 2 things. One, I noticed that attention from the doctor was an important factor. That they saw that going into a trial, they would get increased attention and contact with the doctor. So maybe we could talk about having more frequent attendance also when there are no trials. And also how much are we influenced, especially in the Nordic countries, that now more and more research are happening on the basis of private funds. As a public research is being more and more dependent, as at universities and other places are being more and more dependent on private funds. How does that affect the research happening? And does that actually mean that there's research that is not being carried out because funds are not available? And to the last speaker, I agree a lot, but what would be the costs of that policy? Because again, public funds are not, they are under pressure. And also for the healthcare sector in Denmark, we have big cost to medicine is actually exploding the cost for the hospitals. So doing that policy, what would be the increased cost of that, and can we just afford that? And I agree, of course, everybody should survive, but there's also the other balance towards what would actually be the issue of doing it.
Thank you so much. Should we take there were 2 other persons who had questions in the back there? And if you could keep it brief, because otherwise we won't have time for the responses. So, yeah.
My name is Gunnel Diesfeldt, and I am a doctor. And I would like to ask the last speaker whether it could be, as she is also a doctor and a patient, and if it could be the way the structure of the doctors is in the system, that it is more difficult to advance in the system if you don't go the regular way. So if it is worth keeping this structure, if it really helps people or if it helps the doctors in advancing, maybe we should think a little out of the box and think, how could we do to do the best for the patients, and try to look at what is done in the world as a whole to advance in some cases.
Thank you so much. And then we had the last one here in the front. Yeah.
My name is Aisosa. I'm a master's student from Malmö University in Biomedical Software Sciences. My question is, I'm wondering, why are we still using chemotherapy when there are evidence that it actually leads to the death of the patient. And I have a question for the second speaker. Another thing I was wondering, since there are evidences that shows that your therapy is working, why are they fighting against it? Because it's strange to me, because I studied biotechnology as my background, and I believe that the best way to go to curing diseases today is going back to nature. Because chemicals have been proven over and over again as it might cure something and cause another damage. So I'm wondering why all these, is it politics that they overlook the good because the powerful controls the bad?
Okay, thank you. So I think that was a question for each speaker. So would you like to start, Jonathan?
Sure. So I think the question that was directed at me is why regulatory authorities approve so many drugs that only have equivocal evidence of efficacy. I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. I mean, some of the approvals of surrogate benefit may in fact have survival benefits, just that it's not established. And so, you know, that 2/3 pie, some of that, it might be smaller if, you know, those drugs were put to rigorous evaluation. That still doesn't answer the question of why half of the drugs that are approved based on survival benefit don't seem to have a substantial benefit for survival. You know, it's, you know, there's a whole other question, there's a whole other discussion to be had about whether the standards that regulatory authorities currently use is the appropriate standard. My talk was primarily about the question of whether or not we ought to relax the current standards, and I was saying the current standards are already fairly permissive.
So moving on to the next, yeah? There was also a question to you, Akseli.
Yeah, I think the question to me was about the drug approval process. So it's a very tightly regulated process, and I think for good reason. I mean, it's there to protect patients. But I think right now we live in a time of over-regulation, so that the regulation has sort of maybe gone a bit too far, and it has made trials incredibly expensive. So now, you know, only drug companies can do trials. I think we lose a lot because drug companies are never going to, you know, do trials where they think that their product will look bad. I mean, let's say we have new drug A, new drug B. It's very unlikely that anybody would pay for a trial where you compare new drug A to new drug B. What they will pay for is new drug A versus older drug C. And you know, I think many of these classic drugs like chemotherapy, they do work to some degree in the sense that for almost every drug there is a randomized trial or several where, you know, survival benefits have been shown, but it's maybe some of the results are a little bit under impressive in the sense that the median survival benefit may be only a couple of months, but that's actually something which you know, hasn't really been mentioned today yet. That 2 months is never 2 months. You know, that's just a statistical thing. You know, somebody benefits a lot, and somebody doesn't benefit at all. And what clinicians do is that they can then stop treatment in those patients who are not benefiting, and continue in those that you know, where the drug is working. But to summarize, I think the biggest problem we have, or two big problems, are, you know, possible over-regulation, and then the funding of research, and especially academic research, you know, together, which I think make you know, it very difficult to develop these newer drugs.
Yeah, a lot of questions. So I try to answer some of them. It was said initially, Kimmelman, that there were only a quarter of the drugs were really effective. It depends what you are defining as effective, of course. So I think that's a strong statement, which is, I don't believe exactly in that. I mean, and use of surrogate markers instead of overall survival. The reason for that is that if you're going to do overall survival studies, you have to wait for quite a long while. It takes years to do that sometimes. And if you have patients who have this disease, and you see it gives you a surrogate marker, it might be a prolongation of life. You cannot not deter to use that, because these patients will die. They can have a chance to get effect from that treatment. And overall survival these days is also more difficult than before, because patients who progress on one disease in a trial, they may have a crossover to the other arm in the study. So the overall survival benefit may be less than what really it could have been measured if you had said you cannot cross over to the other arm, which looks better at the time. So that's kind of difficult. So I think we have to have, and almost all the drugs now are, at least in cancer, are registered on surrogate markers, almost all. One thing was that cost of drugs was mentioned. Yes, absolutely, it's horrendous cost in oncology. Terrible. I mean, it's difficult to understand how we can live with it, because now it's coming new drugs and added, or new too expensive drugs. You know where's gone in. But remember still that cost, at least in Norway, of drugs is only 6-7% of the total healthcare budget. And for cancer drugs, it's less than less than 1%. So yes, it is rising, but it's not a problem at the moment. So, and it's difficult to say that, you know, these drugs are so expensive. We have done research on it, clinical trials, looks wonderful, but we can't afford them. I mean, well, what would the public say? I mean, would they have confidence in the healthcare system, which has that attitude? I don't think so. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
And I'll try. I'll follow up on what you said and your question on the drug prices. I agree, the cancer drugs are extremely overpriced. And the problem is also that, as you mentioned, there's often only a little benefit, 1 month increased survival and so. What I'm, in my talk, was suggesting is that we add more non-toxic treatment, cheap treatment. For instance, this metformin that I was mentioning gives you an extra 8 months to live, and it costs like $10 a month. So it's extremely cheap. To your question about why is this natural treatments not used, the big problem in our healthcare system is that we need phase 3 evidence. At least the oncologist needs phase 3 evidence to recommend a treatment. And for all these natural substances, there's the big problem that they never reach a phase 3 trial because it costs millions of dollars that no one, of course, will pay. And that's why a lot of really, really good stuff gets kind of stuck at phase 2 level. And that has actually, as a doctor coming into this field, reluctantly into this field, what has surprised me the most is that there's so incredible amount of phase 2 evidence for very, very good anti-cancer drugs that are not used. And I think it's really a disaster that this is not used.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think there seems to be an issue related to regulation on the one side and funding on the other side, and the combination of regulation and funding, because, I mean, you can't use it before it's actually tested out in further trials, and the further trials will cost a fortune. Is it sort of the stumbling block here, or what is sort of the crucial issue at stake in the combination of regulation and funding? Because, of course, we would all need that funding was unlimited. That would be nice. And in regards to regulation, I hear some different positions here. It's too loose, maybe, or it's too strict. But maybe it's a combination between the two of them that is actually the real stumbling block. What do you think about that?
I'll just say a couple words here. I mean, I think you're asking a complicated empirical question, and I'm not sure there is really clear evidence to fully resolve that question. I don't know exactly how it works in Europe, but I know that in the United States, somewhere around 25 to 50% of cancer prescriptions are off-label. So in other words, they're given under conditions that are not actually approved by the FDA. And they're often, not always, but many off-label treatments are on the basis of phase 2 trials rather than phase 3 studies. And if you're a company, and at least again in the North American context, there are a set of guidelines that recommend your prescription off-label, you'd be crazy to run a phase 3 randomized controlled trial, because you might actually end up invalidating a treatment that's already been recommended for reimbursement in clinical practice guidelines. So I actually think that once a drug's approved, we've sort of heard this theme, there actually are disincentives after the initial approval for companies to run those rigorous trials. The issue about intellectual property, I think it's more complicated. I can't speak with any authority on this issue, but companies can go and repatent a drug if there's a new indication. And so after a drug gets approved, typically there's a lot of extensive exploration of other indications. So a drug might be approved for renal cell carcinoma. After that approval, there might be testing for gastrointestinal stromal tumor, lung cancer, all sorts of other indications. And my understanding is that companies can and often do file a new patent for that drug, for that particular indication, and that can oftentimes extend the life of the drug. But the bottom line is companies don't necessarily need to seek that intellectual property protection and get that rigorous phase 3 clinical evidence if in fact physicians are free to write recommendations off-label, and guidelines are recommending that. What I would say is a promising approach that might be interesting, that might incentivize more rigorous evaluation of drugs after they're approved, is to peg the pricing of drugs to the level of the evidence supporting the utility of that indication. So if a drug has actually gotten approved by EMA or FDA, that might justify a much higher price. If a drug is being used off-label on the basis of phase 2 clinical evidence, in principle, if you could charge a greater fee for that, that would encourage healthcare systems to be much more restrictive about using that drug, and that would create a much stronger financial incentive for companies probably to undertake the costly evaluations of those drugs in proper, well-powered randomized trials.
Anyone else who would like to comment on that? And then we will wrap up afterwards. Yeah.
Just a comment on regulation. So first I want to emphasize that regulation it's a good thing, but the problem with the regulation is that it can only increase. There's basically no mechanism for decreasing or rationalizing regulation. So whenever there's some sort of smaller or larger disaster, there's additional regulation is implemented, and the company is then paying for that regulation. It's paid by personnel working on filing things. All of those costs then have to be factored into the cost of the drugs, and because it's not nearly all drugs that make it through phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and then get approved, it means that all costs of even those unsuccessful drugs, or let's say unsuccessful trials, will be factored into those drugs which are then sold for profit, and that's the reason why the price of drugs has really gone through the roof. And I think you just need to look at the percentage of patients participating in clinical trials. I think you mentioned that it's about 3% in the US, and I would claim that everywhere else is less than in the US. It just shows that even for pharma, the trials are sort of almost painfully too expensive. I have two biotech companies, and just to give you a real world number for the cost of studying these drugs, it's about 10 million for a phase 1, about 40 million for a phase 2, at least 100 million for a phase 3.
Thank you.
I just had a comment on the off-label. I think that's more common in the United States than it is in Europe. At least in Norway, you are hardly able to do that at all. So I think that's the same thing in Denmark. I think you cannot prescribe any drug for any disease, although it's characterized enough and toxicity and so on. So that's not a big deal. Curbing costs for drugs is an important issue. Even the President of the United States is talking about that. I mean, he may do something good. But it is a problem. I mean, because there are ways of doing it. You could say that you can have that much. You return your expenses for drug development and a certain profit, and then on you have to go down in price. It's possible, but I don't know. But a lot of things we have of prices in Europe is coming from the United States. And the United States, Medicare and Medicaid, they are not able to negotiate prices with the industry. They are not allowed to. So actually, and you stop me if I'm wrong, they are able to say, well, we need to that price. It may not reflect the cost of developing at all, but you can say, well, I think market will take that. And that price will then be used in Europe. So, I mean, that is a strange thing, but I hope that Medicare and Medicaid could negotiate also. But we need to do that because it's going to be a huge problem. And now we see also patients paying in their own way, and they sell their houses even to get enough money to pay for a new treatment. And that is a negative side of this, which is awful sometimes for patients and families which are left behind. Thank you.
And Sofie, you get the last word if you have a comment.
I don't have any last words.
You don't have any
I
last
agree
words?
with the others.
You agree with the others. Then I think that we'll just close this session and giving a warm hand to the speakers.